So it seems that the brightly coloured war hosts have flown a little too close to the sun. Let's talk Eldar, and the nerfs that they've received in Warzone Nephilim. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a summary of the Craftworld Eldar, who have had the nerf bat rather broadly applied to their army, hitting all sorts of things, whether or not they were actually strong in my opinion. Prior to all these updates, I would say that the Craftworlds were one of the stronger armies in 40k, at least in some of their strongest builds, often making great use of the Hail of Doom Shuriken buff to plough through enemy units, or possibly Ulthwe with their general all-round strong units and psychers, buffing a lot of their units across the whole army and their nice guardians. Games Workshop really has reined in quite a lot of the strongest armies in the game. Tau Tyranids and Harlequins have also been hit pretty hard, but the Craftworlds certainly haven't escaped. In general, the Craftworld points increases were fairly small, but they did affect really quite a lot of units, and they've also had 4 different rules changes which will impact the army and how it plays. We'll talk through the points first, then the rules changes, and then my overall thoughts as to how top lists might adapt, and then go over a few thoughts as to how top lists might adapt to all these alterations. So first up, one of the most broad and all-encompassing nerfs that they had was a general hit to just about every single HQ in the army. If you look at a whole ton of competitive lists, in general Eldar armies did tend to be actually fairly restricted in which HQs they took. You'd almost always see 1 or 2 Farseers, maybe Eldrad Ulthuan might make it in there if you were Ulthwe, almost always backed up by a Barahoth because he was amazing, maybe a bit of room for one of the other Phoenix Lords, or perhaps an Avatar of Cain. For some reason though, Games Workshop in their wisdom do seem to have just hit virtually the entire HQ section, both the units that were being taken and the units that weren't. I suppose if you just want to slightly tone down the general power of the army, it's certainly one way. You're going to need HQs of some sort, so this will usually represent a small increase to most Eldar lists, somewhere between something like 20 or 40 points depending on what you are running. First up, we've got the Phoenix Lords. All of the Codex ones went up, Baharoth went up 20 points, and the rest all went up 10. Personally, I'm not really convinced that the other Phoenix Lords really needed an increase. They certainly weren't bad, particularly ones like Janzar and Karandras, and they can be pretty annoying to shift with their objective secured and also losing no more than 3 wounds in one phase. I think really the problem one was Baharoth though. He was the one that basically jumps on and off the board, killing enemy units at will and also having objective secured and great movement. His damage output maybe wasn't super good for the points, but it was just the fact that he could almost always deal that damage while staying safe that made him a bit of a nightmare. His 20 points increase represents a 14 points increase, and the rest of them went up 10, around about a 6 or 7% increase. I'd say it probably puts Baharoth into the category of a bit more pricey but still usable. Certainly for some of the less played ones like Fugan, I'd be thinking twice. Next up, I'm not sure why they felt that the Autarchs needed to go up, but they've all gone up 5 for some reason. In general, very few people seemed to run Autarchs over the Farseers, and seeing as they both went up basically a similar amount, I still feel that people are usually going to run the Farseers instead. The Avatar of Cain went up to 280 points, plus 10 points from 270, so a small 4% nerf there. He does have some seriously chunky stats, and can solo a lot of characters and punch above his points cost, but again he wasn't one of the absolute competitive staples of Eldar I felt. He certainly has his limitations, being a ground-based walking monster that you can directly target. There's definitely the potential to outrange him for a turn, maybe screen him for a turn, and then deal with him when he's actually in range of a lot of your units. Certainly solid. I'm not really convinced he necessarily needed to go up though. The Farseers on the other hand, I think escaped with a fairly small points nerf considering. I guess it's good for the Eldar that they remain a very strong staple of the Codex, but I think they're still in the area where you can easily run multiple without regrets. Going up somewhere by 5 to 7% on staple HQs really isn't going to hurt them. Sorry, I have noticed that I made a small typo on this one. The Farseer Skyrunner's up to 125, it was 120 before. I guess perhaps the slightly bigger nerf to Farseers is that Eldritch Storm is now far less powerful. I think maybe it still could be usable if the enemy really bunches up, but in general I think that Farseers can absolutely be as efficient as they need to be, just spamming things like Guide, Doom, maybe Fortune or Executioner. They didn't need Eldritch Storm to be good, though it was an extra nice option. Finally we've got the Inari, and again they went up around 4 or 5%, plus 5 on the Vizark and Ivrain, and the Incarn went up 10 to 260. Again, didn't really feel like the most necessary nerf, not a fat lot of people are running Inari compared with standard Eldar. I'd say the characters are one of the main reasons to attract you to Inari in the first place, so having them even be a bit undercosted might not be the worst thing ever. Overall, a fairly bizarre change to the HQ section in my opinion. If you were running Baharoth and a pair of Farseers, which seemed to be one of the most common picks, your list only went up 30 points, not really all that much above if you're running lots of less played combinations. Moving on, we have the squads and the Aspect Warriors. First up, Rangers remain 13 points, but both their bits of gear went up another 5. It's now 10 points for that Gloomfield or Wireweave net, in my opinion probably making both of them into the territory of not really worth it when they were pretty good upgrades before. I feel like people are still going to run Rangers plenty, just as base squads instead, and lay off the upgrades. Next, the Corsair Voidsguard went up very slightly. They remain 12 points base, but the Shade Runner and the Soul Weaver both went up 3. I'm genuinely not sure whether or not that was a intended nerf to make them worse, or whether it was just rounding them up to an even number for neatness. If I had to guess, I'd say it was probably the latter. Neither of them were crazily strong in my opinion. If anything, it was the other one, the Wayseeker, that was probably the best, the one that gives you the Psychic and could just be used to sit around on objectives, farming out a command point a turn if you wanted. Next up, the vast majority of the Aspect Warriors went up. I think the only ones that escaped were the Dark Reapers and Shining Spears, though the Shining Spears did have a nerf to their Exarch upgrade. I guess for the ones targeted, that does seem at least fairly reasonable. They were the ones that were typically seeing the most play, and if you tried to tone down Eldar in general, then small points increases on these are sort of understandable. Most of the things went up 1, the Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders went up 2 though. First up, Dire Avengers went to 13, so plus 8% there. Plus also Hail of Doom nerf will hurt them a little bit. They now only get that one powerful attribute and don't get to combine it with Ignores Cover or something. I still think that they're solid enough. Their damage output is really generalist, and with Doom will delete just about most things in the game with Hail of Doom. They're even at least fairly solid without. They also had their Exarch Power Stand Firm bumped up to 15 points. That's the Objective Secured upgrade. Otherwise, Fire Dragons went up 1 point to 24. If you want the big Melter Alpha strike out of a Falcon, it'll cost a little bit more. Howling Banshees went up 1 to 19 points, making them feel like even more of a glass hammer now, though they still hit pretty hard when buffed. Striking Scorpions went up 1 to 18, even more of a premium for forward deployment. And Swooping Hawks went up 2 to 20, a bigger 11% nerf compared with the rest. I'm not really too surprised that they went up a bit. They were an aspect that was certainly common in a lot of competitive lists. Basically, they shoot, jump off the board, and then redeploy somewhere safe, then jump out with their massive movement and shoot something else. It did feel like they were borderline auto-include territory for one unit before. Kind of like Barahoth, their damage output certainly isn't amazing, but it's the fact that they can do it turn on turn, often with very little chance to counterplay them against the wrong army. They kind of feel a little bit more in line with the other aspects after this. Warp Spiders also went up 2 to 22 points, they're plus 10% as well. Again, they certainly were one of the stronger aspects, particularly with Surprise Assault and a powerful punch out of Deep Strike. Shining Spears do remain 35 points, the only nerf that they had was to Heart Strike, the Exarch power for their mortal wounds on a wound roll of 5+, that paired very nicely with that Paragon Saber. I'd say it's a bit more take or leave now, though it is still a solid damage increase if you can spare the points. Finally, Dark Reapers are completely unchanged, probably for the best, seeing as they were one of the least played and more underwhelming aspects. Kind of good that they didn't get lumped into the nerf with the rest. Overall, it does feel like a bit of a shame to have the aspects reined in a bit. It's quite nice to have them as a powerful part of the army, and a lot of them will feel like even more glass cannons than they were before. It'd be super painful to be losing 22-point Warp Spiders for every single wound, or 20-point Swooping Hawks. I feel like they have actually rebalanced them quite well though. They get to a lot more of a level of feeling on the same sort of power now. I'd say the strongest ones did get hit with the biggest nerfs. Maybe Shining Spears do look a little bit more tempting by comparison. Finally for the squads, the Wind Riders with Scatter Lasers went up to 30 points per model, plus 5 from the previous 25, or a massive plus 20% nerf, one of the most punishing out of this entire update. This one, I must admit, I do find a little bit on the confusing side. I wouldn't really have rated the Scatter Laser as the strongest loadout for the Wind Riders. I think that'd be the Twin Shuriken Catapults in my opinion, and all 3 gun options did seem at least fairly well balanced. If they wanted to nerf Wind Riders, I sort of feel like maybe just a point or 2 on their base profile might not have been the worst thing. Now if you're fielding Wind Riders, it seems like probably the Twin Shuriken Catapults are best, maybe closely followed by the Shuriken Cannons. Maybe someone at Games Workshop had bad memories of 7th edition, where Scatterbites ruled the roost. I suppose these guys could do a fair bit of jump shoot jumping from a long way back and stay very safe, but still it seems a lot more people tended to prefer the Shuriken Catapults over these. Moving on to Grav Tanks and Friends next, there are small increases for the Falcon, Fire Prism and Wave Serpent, all of which were decently usable. And to be honest, I don't think a 5-point increase is really going to change things too much. The Falcon's very nice for a decent bit of firepower, plus the very nice drop pod deep strike. Still seems okay for delivering a unit like Fire Dragons and blasting away turn 1. The Fire Prisms up to 165 still seems okay, but in particular this one will really feel the later nerf to Vectored Engines, which is a lot more for the upgrade, 20 points rather than 10 on every single Grav tank. This one was a really popular pick on things like Fire Prisms, as it basically lets you use Battle Focus once per game, tip the very edge of your tank outside terrain, get line of sight for one of them, maybe use that linked fire to ignore inballs and fire 2 tanks through one tank, and then use your once per game Battle Focus to head back to safety. With people using Fire Prisms, a lot of people quite like to use that rule. The tank's not really all that tough if the enemy gets to shoot it, and they do go down pretty quickly to any anti-tank fire in range. I'm not sure if people will still overall feel that that's worth it now at 20 points. Potentially you might just be able to have your Fire Prisms right at the very back of the board with a big 60-inch range, and hopefully just get line of sight and outrange any counter threats. The Wave Serpent's small nerf to 145 points base still seems to make it usable. Perhaps a bit more of a nerf is that you can't combine that Mobile Fighter's reroll all hits with Hail of Doom anymore, so that certainly puts a spanner in the works for things like Dire Avengers piling out of Serpents. For some reason the planes went up, the Crimson Hunter Exarch and Hemlock Wraith Fighter both went up 5 points. I feel like out of the Eldar motor pool these guys weren't really sticking their heads above the parapet too much. I'd have rated them weaker than any of those 3 Grav tanks, so not entirely sure why they put themselves in line for a points increase. Again, it is a very small nerf, I don't think it's really going to change too much, but it just seems a bit weird as you didn't see loads of them appearing in top lists whatsoever. Overall, for the points changes, I feel like the ones that are going to be felt the most are the ones to Baharoth and the Farseers. Then out of the aspects, maybe particularly the ones to Dire Avengers, Howling Banshees and Swooping Hawks, all of which seem to be very common picks. Compared with say Tyranids though, the increases really aren't quite so punitive. Tyranids had loads of things going up in the 10 to 20% range, a lot of the Eldar increases are sub 10%. Of course these are all paired with a fair few rules changes in Nephilim. First up, that one to Hail of Doom, the Shuriken rule. It's the absolutely bonkers one for Shurikens, where every hit roll of a 6 counts as a wound roll of a 6, and it makes things like Dire Avengers and Windrider jet bikes and things just chew through near enough anything in the game. Now you can't combine that attribute with another Craftworld trait, so you couldn't put it, say, with Masterful Shots to ignore cover, or their equivalent of Stealthy for cover at long range, or Mobile Fighters to get out of tanks. To be honest, I'm kind of impressed that they've actually kept the rule the same way that it was. It's still a very tempting option, and a good way that you can build Craftworlds. I feel like it's still very playable, and people will be able to make mass shuriken lists if they want to. Dire Avengers might be a bit pricier, and they might not get ignore cover with this anymore, but still if you combine that with Guide and maybe Doom, they'll be blasting tanks off the board like nobody's business, never mind anything that's lighter. Next up was a change to Eldritch Storm, and I honestly think that the FAQ type thing on the balanced data state maybe wasn't all that well written. I feel like they might need to go in and just clarify that a little bit further as to how it's supposed to work now. It remains one use only, and it still was before, and it's still that big expensive 3 command point stratagem where you have a bunch of Farseers focus their will on one part of the battlefield and basically make loads of mortal wounds happen. I think the way that this is intended to work now is that each unit within 6 inches rolls a dice on a 4+, they take the mortal wounds rather than a 2+, and then the regular Farseers can still empower the storm for the 1 extra, but they can only do so if they can see the centre of the marker, so no more doing it from behind terrain. Previously you could really vomit out a whole ton of mortal wounds onto the enemy's army with this, but now it feels a lot more questionable. Any one unit isn't guaranteed to be affected by it, and you're only going to be getting around 60% of the mortal wounds you would have before, which I think is usually going to mean it's not going to be worth it for giving up all your powerful casts plus a big 3 CP. I suppose it could still be an interesting surprise move that you could do if your opponent manages to clump absolutely tons of expensive units together, but I think its use is going to be a lot more niche now, particularly with command points being more restricted in Nephilim towards the start of the game. Still though, Farseers are awesome, they'll still be great doing all of their regular buffing or mortal wound powers. Finally, and perhaps the biggest nerf to Eldar in general, I think might be the restriction on the stratagems Matchless Agility and Fire and Fade, both of which were different flavours of Move Shoot Move. Matchless Agility was the battle focus one for automatic 6 inches, it's now nerfed to just reroll the d6 if you get a low result. Still adds a bit more reliability, but you can no longer guarantee that it's going to get you back inside terrain if you happen to have to move through area terrain. It just ups the chance of you not falling flat on your feet and roll low. Otherwise, Fire and Fade is the big 2 command point one for Move Shoot Move, You can now only use this once per game, and I think that this one's perhaps the biggest deal on really big units with decent movement but also were quite fragile. I think it was perhaps one of the best on Harlequin Void Weavers, to be honest. You can't just have a unit of 3 of them just jumping out of terrain for the first few turns and deal a whole load of firepower with complete impunity. Certainly might change a little bit of list construction. It's still a really powerful stratagem, but now it's only going to be a one-time boost. I suppose on a very minor upside, it might well alleviate a little bit of the Nephilim command point pressure. You might have struggled to build around this quite as much anyway, given fewer command points going round, and if you were using it all game long, you'd certainly be giving up a ton of other powerful options. So overall, let's put it together a bit and talk about a few likely changes to top Craftworld armies. Overall, I think in the HQ section, I feel like Games Workshop have just further incentivized you to run multiple Farseers over the other choices. The Phoenix Lords actually went up even more percentage-wise than the Farseers, and the Autarchs went up similarly. Baharoth seems like far less of an auto-include, though still seems good enough to justify the cost, and just plus 5 points on the Farseers doesn't seem the worst. That Skyrunner build with the Kurnaus Bow Shuriken Pistol in Hail of Doom still seems just as strong as ever. Speaking of which, Hail of Doom still seems excellent for Shurikens. You do lose the second bonus such as Ignores Cover, which is a nerf, but still Wind Riders or Dire Avengers with that attribute will still be wrecking face and piling the wounds on heavy targets and infantry alike. I still think that people will be running it, though it is a bit weaker than before and a few more people might be tempted by Orthway. As a minor incentive to Orthway, Eldar was the Farseer that didn't go up for some reason, so he's more of an attractive choice if you are running them. I do wonder whether or not people might run more Harlequins patrols. I guess in Nephilim there is more pre-game command point pressure. Sacrificing 2 command points for a patrol is a lot more painful than it used to be, but at least in terms of efficiency, most of the Harlequin units were pretty much unchanged from the update. Light and Dark Sadas was slightly nerfed, but perhaps the biggest nerf came to the Luck of the Laughing God rerolls, and that isn't relevant if you're fielding them as an ally. The troops in particular still look like very attractive units, particularly with all the aspects going up. Otherwise, Swooping Hawks are going to be seen as a bit more of a luxury. I still feel like you could easily include a big unit of 10 with that 5+ Feel No Pain relic. Jump Shoot Jump Fire Prisms again lost out a little bit compared with their competitors, and big fragile fire and fading units are going to be a bit less popular too. Still though, I do feel that for all the wide-ranging nerfs hitting some good units and some bad ones, there's really quite a lot of good units that didn't get touched at all. Wind Riders with Shurikens are still very efficient whether or not you're running Hail of Doom. I'd expect to see more of them than before. Shining Spears outside the Exarch upgrade are still great. Not loads of defense, but they can almost jump from one deployment zone to the other and still shoot and charge, which is pretty crazy. Cheap Vipers for actions and objectives aren't going anywhere, they're still really solid. Base cost Rangers are still likely to be filling out troop slots, maybe a fair bit more relevant now that the battalions and patrols are a bit more incentivized by Nephilim. The Webway Gate is still just the same, a fair few people like to run that, and Warlocks I guess got a very small leg up compared with Farseers, as they didn't increase. Overall, plenty of competitive staples still seem fine. The strongest units that did go up arguably got fairly small points increases compared with Tau and Tyranids, and I think overall things are still looking pretty bright for the Craftworld army. I'd expect them to still be upper mid-tier at the worst. A lot of the best lists might have gone up something like 50 to 100 points, and I don't think that that's too bad considering. Overall, a few of the nerfs might not be the most logical, but the army is still good overall, and it might actually open up a few of the lesser played units into being a bit more viable compared with their competitors. In any case, let me know what you think. How bad do the Craftworlds have it after this change? Do you still think they're going to be strong? And which units and combos do you think are going to be strongest for the army going forward? If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.